Great. Well, thanks for joining us today, and happy Pride. My name is Bren. I use they, them pronouns, and I am on the advisory council for SGP. I also was a treasurer and a co-president, and I co-lead the Breaking Binaries group, which I will tell you a bit more about in a few minutes. And we are here today talking about inclusion in sports, challenges for trans athletes and athletes with intersex variations. So I'm very excited for this conversation, very timely. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us. We'll have time for conversation and questions after, so please hang on to those. So our agenda, I will go through a little bit of housekeeping and some community safety norms. Then I'll tell you just a brief bit about SGP and Breaking Binaries. And then we will hear from Madeline, Peyoshni, and Chris, who are our speakers, who will share more information that you saw in the event advertisement about trans and intersex issues in athletics. Then we will go to a Q&A. We will stop recording at this point, and so the Q&A will not be recorded, just so folks feel safe asking questions. And then we'll close out. So we anticipate about the first hour will be, of course, my intro and then hearing from the speakers. And then after that, we'll leave a half an hour for Q&A, as long as folks have questions. Yeah, so we anticipate 90 minutes, could be less depending on the questions that folks ask. Next slide. Okay, so housekeeping. If you want to update your name and pronouns on Zoom, you probably know how to do that by now, but if not, if you hover over your little square with your face in it, there's 3 dots. You can click that and click rename. If you want to turn on captions, there is an option at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom menu, so you can do that there. Again, use the chat, please, for discussion, for questions, and we would love if you would introduce yourself. Thank you, which Aparna put in the chat. So if you want to share your name, pronouns, and where you're joining from in the chat, we love to learn where people are joining us from. And yeah, please do that when you have a moment. And then, yes, we will share the recording. We will share the slides. We'll send a follow-up email within the next few days with links to those. So you can expect to hear from us about that. So as I mentioned, we do have some community safety norms. The first one is to respect privacy and confidentiality. Of course, we're going to be recording some of this. That part does not need to stay confidential. But if people put things in the chat or during the Q&A, please just be respectful and don't take screenshots, don't use AI note takers, and seek permission before you share information about anyone. Practice mutual respect. So of course, treat each other with dignity and consideration. We know that this can be a controversial topic, and we're hoping that you all will engage respectfully. Share space conscientiously, it's a hard word, recognize and address power dynamics and privileges within the group. And then we ask that you actively work towards creating an inclusive environment where everyone's voices are heard and valued, particularly those who are most marginalized. We ask that you foster a safe and inclusive learning environment. And so forms of violence, threats, harassment, disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. And we do ask that you avoid using oppressive language or engaging in undermining behavior. And that leads me to our last community safety guideline, which is we do have a moderator, moderators, myself and Aparna. So we reserve the right to remove anyone who violates these agreements. So please just engage respectfully, and I'm looking forward to a really great conversation, and thank you all for joining. Super quick, before we start the Gender Cafe, I do want to introduce the Society of Gender Professionals. If you are not already familiar with SGP, we're a leading global membership-based association of gender practitioners, academics, and activists. And we're dedicated to promoting feminist action and applied research, and then generally raising the profile of gender expertise around the world. So on the screen, you can see our mission, which includes supporting member collaboration, building networks, mentoring, leadership, and then advancing gender equity through feminist action and applied gender research. And then our vision is to become the largest cross-sectoral network of gender specialists worldwide. And we want to have members who feel really empowered with the resources and the networks that they need to thrive in their careers and their lives and their activism as gender specialists, and of course, advancing that gender equality and feminist action. Quick reminder, we are fully volunteer run. We're a nonprofit organization in the US and we're fully supported by our membership dues. If you do want to join as a member, we welcome you to do that by joining, and Aparna will put the link in the chat. By joining as a member, you can, of course, join our growing global community. We've really expanded to be a very global community with folks all over the world. You can run for elected positions in the Secretariat and with our committees. You can apply for member-only professional development funds, which we do offer twice a year. We just sent a call out a few days ago for that. And then, of course, by joining as a member, you're giving us resources to run SGP because, again, we are membership dues supported. And then dues are flexible. We suggest the value of one meal in your local context, which ranges between $2 and like $150. But we also provide free memberships to those who face a financial barrier. So just let us know, and we would love to have you join SGP. So SGP hosts what we call gender circles, and these are communities of practice dedicated to specific themes. So some examples are like feminist self-care, ending workplace sexual harassment, and the intersection of gender and climate justice. And so one of these circles is also the Breaking Gender and Sex Binary Circle, and that is who put together this conversation for today. So the mission of Breaking Binaries is to foster a space to share experiences across cultures and learn more about the complexities of gender and sex diversity in order to create both individual and collective change. So if that sounds interesting to you, please join us. We have nearly 150 members in the Breaking Binary Circle from around the world. We meet monthly to discuss topics around LGBTQI+ inclusion. And then if you'd like to join, there's a registration form that Aparna can add in the chat. And yeah, we would love to see you join a meeting, join a conversation over email, etc. We have lots of ways to engage. And then lastly, before we dive in, one of the programming aspects of SGP is gender cafes. That's what we are doing here that you are joining us for. We do this to foster the production and dissemination of applied gender research. And so these events provide space for feminist discussion, collaboration. We have one every few months. Again, we like to connect our network, so practitioners, academics, and activists. We engage in non-hierarchical sharing and learning beyond the classroom, and really try to make those conversations as opposed to sort of hierarchical knowledge sharing, which is more traditional. And then this also gives folks professional development opportunities. So thanks for joining us today. And thanks for listening to my intro. So today we have 3 goals. The first is to better understand the politicization and the legal landscape that transgender people, non-binary people, and people with intersex variations face when it comes to athletics. And we're going to be talking both about the US and the international scope. We also want to identify best practices for fostering respect and inclusion in sporting environments. And then we just want to provide space for questions, conversation, hear from you about what is coming up in your work and your lives and what questions our speakers can answer. So we're going to go into the presentations now. Like I said, each one will be about 15 minutes. So we should wrap the speaking portion around the top of the hour, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So I'm going to hand the mic to Dr. Madeline Pape from the University of Lausanne, and she will tell us more about herself and then sort of moderate the rest of the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Bren, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with this audience. It's a different audience to my students and also to some of the sports organizations I've had the opportunity to work with. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and to also introducing you to the 2 other panelists, Payashni Mitra and Chris Mosier, who are people I have great respect for and who are doing really important work in this area. Next slide, please. Thanks, Bren. So I am bringing a perspective as a sociologist. I guess first and foremost, I am a brand holder at the University of Lausanne. I have a research project there that is looking at anti-trans movements in the US and the UK. And prior to that, I was an athlete myself. I competed in the sport of track and field and specialised mostly in the 800 metres. And the photo I chose of myself quite a number of years ago now, in 2009, is a photograph that both contains Caster Semenya and is signed by Caster Semenya. In 2009, I had the opportunity to compete at the World Championships for Australia, my home country, in the 800 metres, and was in the same heat as Caster Semenya. And over the subsequent days, saw the controversy unfold around her right to participate in the women's category. And it really wasn't until some years later, when I went to the University of Wisconsin to do my PhD in sociology, that I had the opportunity to reflect back on that moment in my life, and to understand with a different perspective what took place, or a wider perspective, I would say, what took place in those days. In the last couple of years, I've also been engaged by the International Olympic Committee, which is also based in Lausanne in Switzerland, to support their work surrounding the IOC framework on fairness, inclusion and non-discrimination, which is the framework to guide international federations on how to develop policy for applying to transgender athletes and also intersex athletes, but I'll come to that. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be useful to just do a little bit of bringing us up to speed on the background of regulating participation in the women's category at the international level. And my presentation will really be focused on international governance and not on national contexts, though Chris will take us into the US context in his presentation. This is a history that has been really well documented in gender studies. I've included citations for a couple of the pieces I go to regularly to revisit the history. So I won't do a deep dive on the history in this presentation, but I think there's a couple of things that are worth noting. First of all, we can date these efforts to regulate inclusion in the women's category back to the 1930s, which was a time when women were starting to participate in greater numbers in the women's category at the Olympic Games. Official testing really began in the late 1960s and took the form of gynecological exams. This was quickly replaced with what's called sex chromatin testing. It's also known as the buccal smear, was the technique that was used for a couple of decades. And the purpose of the test was to verify the presence of two X chromosomes. The IOC later adopted in the 1990s a test called the PCR test, which was similarly focused on chromosomes but aimed to identify the presence of a Y chromosome. And this continued into the 1990s for the IOC. And during this time, there was also a practice of issuing gender certificates or femininity certificates for women. It was compulsory to be tested and compulsory to have this evidence of having passed the test to compete in the women's category. But this wreaked havoc in the lives of quite a number of athletes who, quote unquote, failed these tests, even though they were women athletes. Often had been, oftentimes women had identified as women their whole lives, had been raised as women, had no reason to think that there was anything to question about their biological characteristics. I won't say so much about the contemporary harms of such policies, though I know Payoshni is really well positioned to help us understand in more recent years what kinds of harms athletes have experienced as a result of eligibility rules. But just a couple of other historical points to note. There was historically an idea about there being male imposters in the women's category, and over time, and especially in the 1990s, there came to be a much just sort of cleaner recognition that actually here we're talking about women with intersex variations. We're also talking about transgender women So a shift away from sort of male imposters, though, of course, this language has in many ways stayed with us. And interestingly, the IAAF, which is now known as World Athletics, the governing body for track and field, back in 1990, actually, they had their first position on the participation of transgender women, which recognised that trans women had a legitimate claim to participate in the women's category, and that it was a question of determining the conditions under which transgender women should compete. And at that time, they had also taken the decision to not exclude women with intersex variations. So certainly an organisation with quite a varied history when it comes to regulating the women's category. One last point I'll make is that what research has shown, and this is on the part of the feminist scholars, often from science and technology studies or from sociology of sport, sociology of gender, who've really studied this history of sex testing practices. One of the main takeaways is that there is no definitive test of femininity. There is no singular trait that can be relied upon to define the boundary of the women's category. And although sports organisations have gone to a lot of effort to try to come up with a definitive definition, this has been elusive. Secondly, and it's a really important point to understand, is that since the 1960s, these efforts have been very much entangled with geopolitical dimensions as well. Anais Bowen did a really great analysis of how in the 70s and also 80s, there was a tendency amongst Western countries to associate male imposters or athletes in need of exclusion with the Eastern Bloc. And more recently, that has shifted to global North countries, often associating intersex variation with countries from the global South. And when we look at this history, we can see that there is always a geopolitical dimension to how policies unfold at the international level. Next slide, thanks. I should also just check, I didn't start my timer. Can you tell me how many minutes are left now?
About 10 minutes left. You have until the bottom of the hour.
Okay, great, thank you. So since the IOC is the organisation that I've done quite a lot of work with in recent years, I thought it would be, and since it is also the organisation that really sets the guidelines for the Olympic movement, I thought it would be helpful to understand the journey that the IOC has been on over the past few decades. The IOC abandoned sex chromosome testing in 1999, and at that point, actually, and this was the case for athletics as well, or track and field, there was a shift towards a sort of ambiguously defined, much more subjective testing protocol, where athletes would be tested if they were deemed suspicious. But for a good number of years, it wasn't well documented how this kind of testing took place. And really, it was with the arrival of Caster Semenya that a lot of these practices were brought back into the open, and there was a lot more scrutiny from that point on how international sports organisations determined these kinds of rules. But in 2003, we had the IOC, a bit like World Athletics back in 1990, release a consensus statement or a consensus position on the participation of transgender women. So that's, the IOC has recognised the legitimate claim of transgender women to compete in the women's category since 2003. And what's evolved over time has been the criteria that trans women have been required to meet. So that initially it was there was a need for sex reassignment surgery to have been undertaken. Later, this shifted to just requiring a testosterone threshold in 2015. Next slide, please. And then from 2015, things started to get pretty interesting, I think we can say, in the world of international sport. If I remain just focused on the IOC for another minute, in 2019, or 2018 actually, the IOC had a follow-up consensus process in which they aimed to update the consensus position on how to advise sports organisations in the Olympic movement on setting rules for trans athletes and intersex athletes. And that consensus meeting failed. There wasn't a consensus position that emerged out of that meeting. And that was as a result of not just scientific questions, but also ethical questions that were raised at that meeting, which impeded consensus. And so the IOC started a new and very different process to what it had done in the past. Instead of restricting itself to a very small group of experts, it launched a much wider consultation process, which importantly included consultation with affected athletes for the very first time. So representatives of the IOC actually sat down with trans athletes, non-binary athletes, athletes with intersex variations, and considered how to take into account the experiences of these athletes in developing guidance for sports organisations. In 2021, at the Tokyo Olympic Games, we saw the first openly trans Olympians competing. And later that year, the IOC released its new position, which I'll summarise shortly. We also had, sort of paralleling this, some consensus positions or some engagement with the scientific community. So in 2021, FIMS, which is the International Federation of Sports Medicine, published a position statement that sort of attempted to outline the state of the research on transgender athlete participation, and which called for further research. And then in 2020, the beginning of 2023, actually, the IOC released a new position statement that basically explains the IOC framework in more detail, and points out also the overlap with some elements of the position of the FIMS statement. Next slide, please. And then paralleling this, we've had a really interesting legal and human rights landscape evolving. This started with a case that Payoshni was very much involved in, an appeal brought to the Court of Arbitration for Sport by Judy Chand. We also saw human rights challenges to the International Cycling Union rules, brought by a Canadian trans athlete. We started to see position statements being released by women's sports organisations, stating support for intersex athletes, stating support for transgender athletes. The World Medical Association and Human Rights Council criticised the imposition of medical interventions on intersex athletes in particular for the purposes of sport. And Caster Semenya has been on her own journey in recent years, seeking to challenge the rules of world athletics on both scientific grounds, but also human rights grounds. Next slide, please. So if I was to summarise what this landscape has looked like in recent years, we've seen increasing calls from the scientific community for relevant research, a sport-by-sport approach. We've learned that there is no one-size-fits-all answer to defining what criteria should be set for the inclusion of trans athletes in particular, and also that the existing research we have at best offers clues, but not definitive answers. There's been increasing legal scrutiny to ensure that any restrictions on participation are reasonable and proportionate. And there has been increasing pressure to be accountable to the human rights and the well-being of athletes. And so harm prevention and non-discrimination have become primary rather than secondary considerations. Next slide, please. The current IOC position is a set of 10 principles which attempt to sort of map this landscape and guide international federations to consider all of the dimensions of the situation of trans athletes and intersex athletes, their rights, the potential for harm through eligibility rules, the ways in which they should evaluate scientific evidence and identify the sport-specific or sport-relevant elements and bring that into their own sport, how they should engage with athletes. There's a real emphasis on hearing from the impacted athletes, trans athletes and intersex athletes early in the process and before a policy decision has been reached. The framework really emphasises sport for all at the grassroots level, so inclusion as the overriding priority in grassroots youth community sport, and calls for, in the case of trans athletes, reasonable accommodations at the elite level. In the case of intersex athletes, it calls for harm prevention at the elite level. And the idea is that these rules, these 10 principles should be considered as a collective whole. But what this framework doesn't do, which previous positions from the IOC did do, is recommend a specific policy approach. So previously there was at least a recommendation, even if it wasn't binding, there was at least a recommendation from the IOC on this is a rule you could adopt if you decide to adopt a rule. Now, there is no such recommendation from the IOC, and that's partly what has created a very complex situation now, where federations are developing their own rules, but not necessarily always following a process that can lead them to eligibility rules that are based on evidence, that respect the rights of athletes, and that are specific to their sport. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and what I wanted to do here is just sort of summarize the current challenges that we've been seeing at the international level, which are sort of in the context of this new IOC position. First of all, there are a lot of challenges that international federations are facing. So international federations are responsible for setting the participation rules or the sports rules for their own sport at the Olympic Games. It's not the IOC who sets eligibility rules for individual sports. It's the international federations themselves. But international federations are a very diverse group. Some of them are large, some of them have a lot of, few have a lot of resources. Many international federations are very small, and they don't have the internal capacity to undertake a sort of ambitious IOC framework aligned process. They're also facing a lot of political pressure. A lot of that pressure is coming from, or some of it is coming from cisgender women athletes, but a lot of it is coming from anti-trans organisations that are not necessarily from the world of sport, but have taken up sport as a space where they want to try to influence decisions. There's also, because of time and expertise constraints, often a limited capacity to critically appraise existing scientific research. So international federations are sort of, on the one hand, being asked to do this ambitious IOC framework-led process, and on the other hand, facing very, very real constraints on their time, their expertise, their resources, their ability to actually put such a process into practice, and at the same time are having to respond to some very loud voices sometimes in this space. We've seen an increasing number of international federations resorting to post-puberty bans, which, as I imagine some people on this call would know, is an effective total ban because there are almost no instances where a young individual would be able to meet the conditions of having undergone and maintained puberty blockers and gender affirming care prior to puberty. This is, it's really an impossible bar for most people to reach. So, but we're seeing an increasing number of IFs go in this direction. So we're really missing best practices and policy models for IFs to help them feasibly move towards positions or policy positions that are not a post-puberty ban. Athletes have extremely limited options for challenging eligibility decisions. I'm sure Payashni will be able to speak to this, but the Court of Arbitration for Sport is sort of the go-to option at the international level and is really unattainable for most athletes, and it's a very difficult process to bring a challenge to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. We recently saw that Leah Thomas sought to have a case heard at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, but it was rejected, not on the grounds of the content of the case itself, but just for the simple reason that she wasn't considered to have standing to bring a challenge against World Aquatics, and that leaves Leah Thomas with very few options to have a challenge heard in time for the Olympic Games. And just two last things. At the national level, there's we've heard from many sports organisations saying they're really struggling with how to sort of interpret what's happening at the international level, yet also meet their obligations in their own national setting. Australia is a context I haven't included in the presentation, but a really interesting one, I think, for gender practitioners to think about how you can put in place the institutional conditions that can foster consistent, inclusive policy decisions. But certainly there is pressure coming from the international level and a lot of ambiguity around how national level organisations should navigate that. And then finally, we're certainly seeing that there continues to be conflation of the situation facing athletes with intersex variations and transgender and non-binary athletes. And these are groups that have distinct needs and can be addressed also distinctly through different policy positions. And we have limited guidance, very, very limited guidance on how to make sport more inclusive for non-binary athletes as well. So I'll end there. I hope this can help with just opening up conversation. I'm sure that it's inspiring more questions than it's answering, as is often the case with this topic. But yeah, perhaps we can move now to the next slide. And I can now hand over to Payashni Mitra, who has just the most decorated CV when it comes to working with athletes to challenge eligibility rules, and is someone who's also been a huge support for my own career and has really opened doors for me. She's the kind of person who opens doors and doesn't close them behind her. So I have a lot I owe a great deal to Payashni, and it's a real pleasure to invite her to speak and share her perspective on the situation facing athletes with intersex variations.
Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm not sure I have been that, I've been able to open doors for you. You really didn't need that. So, but thank you so much. I believe I have 15 minutes. I'll start my timer and quickly move to the next slide and talk about myself a bit. That's what I was asked to do initially. So I've worked with athletes with sex variations, as the IOC used that term, but I would prefer to use innate variations, women athletes with innate variations of sex characteristics for the past 15 years, and nearly 30 athletes from across different countries in Africa and Asia have obviously played an instrumental role in Duty Chund's case, which was the first time one of these regulations were challenged at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in 2014 and 2015, and have been part of all of Castor Semenia's cases, including being an intervener at the European Court of Human Rights recently. Have been also consulted by different federations for a long time, and currently I'm heading Humans of Sport, a new organization which is particularly focusing on the issues of athletes with sex variations. Next slide, please. There are some photographs here, but I'm not sure if I have time. The photographs I had in the previous slide, some of them from European Court of Human Rights, some of them from the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and you would see a lot of, in the previous slide, you probably saw some of these men also present, and many of them are litigators, legal representatives of the athletes you see with me. And it's been really important that we were being able to create these alliances globally, because one of the huge problems with our work has been resources, funding, and many of these lawyers have always come forward working pro bono for these athletes, and that has been very crucial. I'll now move on to next slide. Sorry, Bren. So I start with Annette Negesa's quote. Annette Negesa is a former Ugandan athlete who's now based in Germany. I was still a teenager, had no choice because I had a love of the sport, and they knew all the consequences which would come out from them. They violated my rights as a human being. They treated me like a guinea pig. Now, those of you who haven't heard of Annette Neguesa, I'm sure castrosmania is quite popular. I would like to say a few, sort of give you a little idea about Annette. Next slide, please. So Annette Neguesa represented Uganda in 2011 World Championships organized by the World Athletics, and she ran in the semifinals. Some of you may know that the athletic biological passport, I'm sure Madeleine does because of her fantastic career in athletics, was introduced around in 2011. So all athletes were asked to sort of give blood samples at this World Championships. And then from then on, they started. It didn't really happen for Annette initially until she got to her personal best in 2012, May, in Netherlands, right before the London Olympics. And then she was asked by World Athletics to come to France for further medical investigation. She was young, 19 years old, didn't speak French, and talked about how she didn't understand what the doctors were talking about and had to go through these very intrusive testing from blood to ultrasound to MRI at this French hospital. Following that, she underwent surgery in Uganda, which was coordinated by the National Federation. Estrogen therapy, which becomes quite a crucial thing given this is about gonadectomy, so the very source of your estrogen as well as testosterone is being taken, it's not there anymore. So it's really important for one's bone health to have estrogen therapy. This information was not properly given to her. And gradually she lost her scholarship, lost income, and disappeared for years from 2012 to 2019. None of us knew where she was, doing some menial job, somehow surviving in Uganda. In 2019, I got in touch with her through another athlete I knew from her country. And then she eventually became a whistleblower, speaking about her experience, and in fact had to move to Berlin because of the situation in Uganda, which many of you would know isn't very favorable for the people from the community, from the LGBTIQ plus community. I'll move to the next slide now. So talking about history of harm, the human stories, I would also like to refer you to a Human Rights Watch report that Dr. Katrina Karkazis, myself, and Kyle Knight from Human Rights Watch, we co-authored. And it is still date the most comprehensive sort of document that basically have 13 interviews, in-depth interviews of athletes impacted by, athletes with sex variations impacted by these regulations of the World Athletics. There could be a few things that I will say which can, can be difficult for some of you. Do let me know or take a pause. So among the many different, you see someone's photograph on the right, and that's Pratima from India, Pratima's mother and Pratima's brother, because I have never met Pratima. Pratima died by suicide many years back because of the pressure she was under from her coach after he found out about her various sex variations and threatened to expose her. So this has been the kind of sort of harm that has been caused by these regulations. When we worked on the report, we talked about, certain kind of these different, rights which were violated. And right to privacy and dignity is one where we have seen over and over again test results being exposed. And you see this clip here, sex test reveals athlete's sad secret, world exclusive. This is from 2009, September 2009. And this is from the Daily Telegraph in Australia. And this particular celebrated reporter called Mike Hurst wrote this story breaking private medical information of Castro Semenya. And the public scrutiny that sort of followed this, we all know about it. Right to health is another concern. Interventions, not medically necessary or harmful. And as Madeline mentioned in her presentation, that the World Medical Association also came up with this very strong statement against these regulations, which you see on the right here. Compromised medical ethics. So what we see, many doctors we have spoken with, and I have had the opportunity to speak to, given my work with these athletes, we have seen that they have this dual loyalty where federations employ them or federations are paying them to do these investigations and then suggest these surgeries or even conduct these surgeries. So when they're doing these medical investigations, often they first or only send the reports back to the federations, and the person concerned, not really the patient, but to the doctor, the patient concerned, even though I would say these athletes are not patients because they have no physical problem, no health concerns. They have been forced to go to these doctors because of these regulations. But for these doctors, even before they would hand over the medical reports to these athletes, or they would have to send them to the federation. And many of the athletes I have worked with in different parts of the world, whether it's India, whether it's Kenya, whether it's somewhere else, we have seen that the reports were never given to the athletes. Coercion, for example, where we saw in Annette Negesa's case how she didn't really understand what was going on. She, when she went through the surgery, she thought it was an injection, but it was a surgery, which she realized after the surgery was done. So no informed consent, and also athletes are put in this spot where they will either have to, quit sport or else take medication to continue in sport. And sport is just not something they love to do. It's also something their lives depend on. I'll move to the next slide now, Ren. Thank you. So discrimination, we have seen that athletes are still profile targeted, and doping mechanism traditionally have been a mechanism that has been used over and over again to sort of witch hunt, to identify athletes with variations of sex characteristics. It was the case in the past, but it continues to be so in a very sophisticated fashion. Medical commissions of these federations, and in particular, World Athletics, I'm talking about mainly World Athletics here, but all medical commissions have access to the data that WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, have because of anti-doping purposes. Now, WADA Code 2021 adds that the samples collected for anti-doping purposes can be used for other regulations like DSG regulations or transgender regulations, which kind of writes off athletes' right to say no. And we also have seen a lot of harassment and ostracization during events, in media, in social media of the athletes. You see an example below. If you see that I have intentionally not mentioned the games. This particular games where false transgender claim shows anti-trans bias in sports has legs. So there was this whole issue of bullying in a particular game because somebody, one competitor, thought the other woman competing with her was a transgender person. She just bullied her so much that there is an ongoing sort of case going on that. And we see here how the British media, for example, has worked and in favor of World Athletics, obviously, because we can't forget the president is from this country and is quite powerful here. And you see that the headline of this particular news, it's just an example of many examples I can give. Dina Asher-Smith qualifies for 200-meter final and will race intersex athlete Amina Husseini. Now, Amina was in the finals as the sixth. She wasn't somebody who was really competing for the medal. She was not competing with Dina for the medal. She was only the sixth. She had the sixth, rank when she went to the finals. But the way this is written is as if Dina is only racing Aminatu, and it's a competition between them. So how the media also sort of adds to this harassment and ostracization. Lives and livelihood harmed, obviously, we have enough examples about the psychological trauma, loss of income, as we have seen in Nagisa's case and many other cases. And if I move to the next slide, Bren. Currently, what we have seen that because of this increased scrutiny as a result of this blanket ban by World Athletics, many of these athletes are under huge, risk in their own countries like Kenya, countries like Uganda, where the laws are not supportive, where the laws are particularly unprotective of the LGBTIQ plus community. And there is a increasing risk, and such blanket ban puts increased scrutiny over these athletes. And at this point, as part of Humans of Sport, I'm just focused on trying to relocate some of them who are at high risk. So the relocation bit, we have done this with Annette Negesa in the past, but now the requests are increasing because of the growing sort of number of anti-LGBTIQ laws in many of these countries and the tension in many of these countries. And also trying to find alternative careers, because it's been a difficult time going back to Court of Arbitration for Sport over and over again, even though we are also working on further legal challenges. Funding, resources have been the biggest challenge. As Madeleine put it, it's very difficult for women from Global South countries to sort of access these courts. Access to justice is a huge issue, because even to apply a court fee of 1,000 Swiss francs, an arbitration fee would be about 25K to 30K Swiss francs. It's a huge financial thing. And then you have to travel, you need to pay your lawyers, even if they file pro bono, you need to travel, you have athletes from across, and you need experts. This is such a complex issue. I was looking at the chat, everybody's saying this is so complex. So given all of this, this has been a huge barrier. And I just want to note that my focus was World Athletics. In other sports like football, the experiences could be slightly different, given, for example, FIFA has a human rights department, which has been helpful with some of the athletes I have been working, some of the footballers I have been working with. And I think that's where I end, if I'm right. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you so much. And up to, I think Madeleine is going to introduce Chris first. And I'm so happy to be part of this fantastic panel and speak with you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Payoshi, and I'm looking forward to the questions you'll undoubtedly get when we get to the Q&A section. So Chris, we're going to hand it over to you now to bring us up to speed on the fast-moving US context. Chris is a real champion of transgender, non-binary athletes, trans and non-binary communities in the US context and further afield. Really gives a lot to his sports as well as his communities, and has been a real trailblazer in the US context, in terms of educating athletes on the topic of inclusion, figuring out how to productively engage sports organizations and help them understand the complexity of this topic. I mean, Chris has really CV yards and yards long of all the engagement work that he's been doing with athletes and organizations. So really happy that you were available to join us for this panel, and very much looking forward to your presentation, Chris.
Thank you so much. So we can go to the next slide to kick it off. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Mosier. My pronouns are he and him, and I am a white person with short brown hair and an incredible brown curly mustache, wearing a black t-shirt, and I'm standing in front of a black racing bicycle and a wall full of bike tires. I'm joining you today from the unceded homelands of the Potawatomi people, also known as Chicago, Illinois. I was the first transgender man to make a men's US national team in 2015, and my desire to compete was a catalyst for the IOC policy change in 2015 to 2016. 2016, I became the first trans athlete to compete internationally under those new rules and their lived gender, and I was the first trans athlete to compete in the Olympic trials in their lived gender as well. I'm still competing. I have an upcoming world championship race later in this year, and I use sport as my platform to have these incredible conversations, because it really was through my lived experience of being a trans person in sports and growing up and participating in girls and women's sports that has shaped my perspective on this. I come to this work focused on gender equity, gender justice, and liberation for all. And in 2013, I created the website transathlete.com, which is a resource for athletes, coaches, administrators, and anybody curious about policy to find policy in sports for trans people and non-binary people at various levels of play. So we're going to begin with the US context. In the United States, the topic of trans athletes, and specifically trans women participating in women's sports, has become a lightning rod topic, as you are surely aware. This is particularly evident in an election year, and with many politicians campaigning on the promise to take away or severely limit the rights of transgender people, including in access to healthcare, representation in educational settings, and of course, in sport. So I want to give you the bigger picture of the all-out attack that's happening on the LGBTQ plus community in the United States. Now, each year since 2020, we've seen an increase in anti-LGBTQ and specifically anti-trans legislation, which has really morphed in pretty predictable but somewhat unexpected ways. So first off, the trends that we're seeing and how we got here. Now, when we look at the US context, and we can go to the next slide, please. Hundreds of anti-LGBTQ plus bills, many of which have been focused on trans and non-binary people, have been introduced in state and federal legislative bodies across the country over the past 5 years. And these bills really vary in scope, but encompass sports, access to healthcare, drag performances, school curriculum, bathrooms, and so on. But sports really has remained a powerful and clear wedge issue, especially, as I mentioned, in election years. So on the slide right now is a map. The ACLU is tracking 522 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation this year. There's an organization called Trans Legislation Tracker that says over 340 of those are specifically anti-trans pieces of legislation currently active, and 50 anti-trans federal bills have been introduced this year. The number of anti-trans bills across the United States has broken records for 4 consecutive years, and in 2023, the total number of bills surged to more than 3 times the previous record. Next slide, please. So this is a powerful visual map of the explosion of anti-trans sports legislation specifically. Now, 5 years ago, trans youth could play sports in schools based on the policy of their state high school athletic association. There were no state laws, there were no federal guidelines beyond interpretations of Title IX, which is currently a gray area around transgender, non-binary, and intersex youth in sports because the final sports ruling has been delayed. And I would say the future of this rule as a means for protecting trans and non-binary students is likely dependent upon the outcome of our election. In 2022, Idaho passed the first law restricting trans athletes in school sports just before COVID-19 ended legislative sessions across the country. And HB 500 was the first outright state ban on trans athletes, imposing intrusive sex verification requirements for athletic participation that really mirror what Madeline was speaking about from the 1930s to the 1990s, essentially. What this means is that a female athlete's gender, if it's called into question, she could be subjected to invasive genital screenings simply to prove she is a woman. To put that in perspective, genital inspections on 14-year-olds obviously didn't go over very well, but the bill still became a law. But the strategy here is that introducing extreme bans like this allow less invasive, but still incredibly restrictive and demeaning legislation to be seen as more moderate and acceptable. So by the end of 2021, we had 10 states banning trans youth, 18 states by the end of 2022. And as we moved through those 2 years, we saw bills move away from the conversation of genital inspections and move towards birth certificates. Then, upon learning that trans people can change their birth certificates in some states, lawmakers morphed the bill language to birth certificate at or near the time of birth. Also in 2022, we saw more states add a private right of action, allowing individuals to sue for damages if they played against a trans athlete. At the end of 2023, 23 states had passed laws, and today we have 24 states that have passed laws banning trans youth, and Alaska passed a policy when its law failed, which is essentially the same type of ban on trans athletes. So today we have half the country banning transgender youth from playing school sports with their friends. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there was and is no national policy for transgender and non-binary high school student athletes. State policies are a patchwork in those states that don't have laws. Some can compete without restrictions, some can compete with jumping through some hoops, and some can't compete at all. The scrutiny here is always on trans women and girls. Very few of these bills specifically discuss trans boys, and none of them mention non-binary athletes. And also, state policies are overridden if a state law is passed. So, we have this inclusive framework and guidance from the International Olympic Committee, but a trans kid can't play soccer in school in half of our country in the United States. Additionally, according to the AP press, there have been more bills and laws created to ban trans youth from playing than there actually are out trans girls playing sports. As an example, when the Utah governor vetoed the anti-trans sports ban in his state, his reasoning included that there were only 4 trans youth playing sports in his state, and only 1 was a trans girl. The state legislature eventually overturned the veto, and the bill became law, banning that 1 student from playing sports. Next slide, please. Now, in the United States, NCAA competitions also, just talking about college policies quickly, NCAA competitions also default to national governing body policies, which create a lot of confusion for athletes, coaches, and event organizers alike when sport has no clear guidance. So for the NCAA rules, if there is no national governing body policy for a sport, that sport's international federation policy would be followed. And if there's no international federation policy, the previously established International Olympic Committee policy criteria would be followed. So take an example like a very popular sport like basketball. As an example, USA Basketball and its international federation have no policy. And so young basketball athletes are left confused and unsure of where to look for guidance. Additionally, in 22 states from that map previously shown, state law bans college athletes as well, overriding NCAA policy. Now, moving on to US national governing bodies. In the United States, we've seen a variety of policies outside of youth sports that have been influenced by international federations. And while, again, the IOC says international federations should make their own policy, many have not, leaving US national governing bodies to create their own. And again, many have not. So in all cases, when these policies have been made in reaction to the presence of an athlete who wants to participate, we've seen rushed policies, copied and pasted policies, and a lack of inclusion of trans and non-binary athletes in that decision-making process. Also worth noting that elite policies like those of national governing bodies and international federations often trickle down and have an impact on youth sports. So why? I came out publicly in 2010, and since then we've seen an increase in the number of athletes who are transgender, but partly because they've seen that visibility. It's worth noting that trans athletes are drastically underrepresented statistically at every level of play. And with increased visibility comes increased pushback and efforts to suppress communities. Sports has really become a battleground, but not because there are problems with trans people playing sports. And in fact, we've seen in hearing after hearing, lawmakers can't actually name trans athletes in their states. But I want to be clear about this. This is not a political issue. My identity as a trans person and as a trans athlete is not political. It has become politicized and weaponized in an attempt to harm the trans community. And we've consistently seen in the United States and globally this conversation framed as, quote, protecting women's sports, which is really code for excluding trans women and girls from women's sports. Many of the bills are actually called the Save Women's Sports Act or an Act to Protect Women and Girls, air quotes around both of those. But the goal here is to position cis women and girls against trans women and girls, at first suggesting, but now really saying directly that we have to choose between fairness in sport and welcoming trans people onto our teams. But we know that sport can be safe and fair without excluding anyone. And even more importantly, we also know that these bills actually do nothing to save or protect women and girls from the real harms that they face, like high rates of sexual assault and abuse, lack of opportunities for professional play, lack of media coverage, pay inequity, and more. Seeing all of this legislation introduced and the many hours discussed and the taxpayer money spent on this topic, you might think that there's a huge wave of trans athletes playing and winning, but that is not the case. And just as an example, in collegiate sports, if 1% of the US population is transgender and 480,000 athletes play in the NCAA, there should be about 4,800 trans athletes participating. But in 2022, there were just 32 trans athletes participating in the NCAA. Final note I want to make here is about policing of gender. All of these policies and bills are not about protecting women and girls. They actually subject them to more scrutiny on their bodies in ways that hurt all women and girls, not just transgender ones. Policies policing gender have been around since the beginning of sport, and as Madeline mentioned about the Olympics. But I also want to say that there's a layer of racism within these policies that cannot be separated from the attacks on trans women and girls. The rules in place and the scrutiny on bodies disproportionately impact Black, Brown, and Indigenous women and women and girls from the global South as they use this sort of model of white Eurocentric femininity as a guide to policing people's bodies and expressions. This policing of gender has really led to the bills and laws about restroom use and access to public spaces as well. And these barriers put an athlete under such high scrutiny that many trans athletes stop playing or wait to transition after their athletic career has ended. Expanding quickly on what Peyoshni mentioned in her presentation about the media, I think this is an important call out, and I just want to end on this. Trans people in the media have become a hot topic for ratings and engagement, which really drives more articles. And this is directly related to the policies that we've been seeing, the bills and laws introduced, and our policies in national governing bodies and international federations. According to a Media Matters study, right-wing articles about trans athletes outperform all other stories about trans issues, earning hundreds of thousands or even millions of interactions. And this sort of clickbaiting has led to even more sensational headlines and poor coverage, with most articles about trans athletes never actually even talking to a trans person or to an ally in our community. Trans and non-binary athletes are overwhelmingly represented negatively in mainstream media, and we don't see those supportive stories of the many hundreds of cis women athletes who support trans women participating in sports covered. So to further illustrate this point, from Athlete Ally Media study done in 2021, analyzing all English articles, only 7.8% of media coverage on trans athletes specifically talked about a trans athlete as a person, not just in theory. And 78% of those articles discussed women alone. So there's an overall erasure of trans voices and lived experiences in the media, and these stories completely ignore trans men and non-binary folks. And the reason I say this is that this rhetoric harms all women, narrows the definitions of gender and femininity, meaning that gender is policed and anyone who doesn't fit a particular idea of womanhood is questioned, and good female athletes can actually compete themselves out of the women's category. So to conclude, trans people play sports for the same reason as anyone else, to be a part of a team, to challenge ourselves, and for the love of the game. These attacks on the trans community in sports are not just about sports. It's not about healthcare. It's not about library books or drag queens either. It's really about trying to eliminate us and keep us from participating as full citizens, to deny us of our dignity, our respect, and our basic human rights. And I think it'll take years of legal battles and public campaigns to undo the damage that's been done in the last 5 years. But I truly believe that sport is a vehicle for social change, and that with the help of our allies and teammates, there is a future for transgender, non-binary, and intersex athletes in sports here in the United States and around the world.
Thank you so much, Chris. So I think we have 21 minutes for questions. And we've had a few questions come through already in the Q&A, but please also feel free to add in your questions now. If we go back to some of the questions that were put in earlier,